Marcel who acted and thought in an almost entirely American manner, now in his 60s, having overcome the habits of French Paris and Parisian upbringing, one day stopped in his downstairs hallway and considered a delicate-looking table with one drawer that he hardly noticed anymore, but into which he had seen his old friend place a pad of paper and a pencil earlier that morning. The pencil was charcoal, the kind one unwinds rather than sharpens. The friend was Palau, a woman with whom he had been close in his 20s, but had not seen since, and who was staying a few weeks with him and his wife for reasons that either she had not clearly explained or he had not entirely understood. She had always been an artist and free in a way his wife called irresponsible. But what had she drawn this time? She had filled the tables and countertops of their home in the first days of her visit with sketches and drawings, black on white, scattered and left askew, slowly covering the squared stacks of bills to pay, catalogs to browse, books on history and the law through which Marcel in his spare time methodically plodded. His wife, fastidious from brow to soul, had decided that Marcel's friend and her messes were his chore, but she clenched her teeth each time she passed by the growing piles, and leaving them as they were took more effort than straightening them would have. Marcel, for his part, liked the drawings. He liked the changes that Palau brought to the rhythm of the home he and his wife had kept together for so long. He knew his wife's opinion of the strewn art and wanted to see what she would do if he left the sketches scattered. It was a sort of game, he supposed. He was feeling playful. Palau sometimes spent hours on the back patio sketching the sea and the forest of masts angling up from sailboats docked in the harbor below. Other times she drew clocks, and vases, or the paintings on the walls, which she changed in subtle ways that affected Marcel deeply. Or else the garden plot his wife kept, or their piano. Many were of him in various details and postures. A few of his wife, face smudged or turned away to some task. One sketch of him in particular, one Palau had drawn her first night there, the night he had made her a gift of the charcoal pencil and rough paper pad, the night they had stayed up longer than probably was prudent, and then his wife thought strictly necessary, though she had continued to refill their tea and whiskey until finally making her excuses somewhat after midnight. That sketch he had pinned to the wall by his private desk, the one to which he retired to study or compose articles or essays, or very occasionally, when his habits became routine, to smoke the meerschaum pipe he had bought when in Turkey some years before on a business trip, and about which on his return his wife had expressed some surprise, since he had not before shown interest in tobacco. He surprised her so rarely that the surprise itself surprised her, which Marcel had found charming, and he had kissed her quickly on the lips. Palau, he had said later that night, after bringing what remained of the whiskey from the kitchen and refilling their tiny glasses, "This is just like it used to be, just like our old times together. Why, it seems so little has changed between us, despite all the years." "Maybe, Marcel," she said, maybe time is not lost like the water under bridges. Maybe time is a tide that always brings back to us the things it has swept away. Maybe it's like the currents that run in circles around the earth. You always say the most interesting things, Palau, he said, a little dazed with drink and maybe also something else. And you talk like you were French. An old joke. Are you sure you're not? And so it went, just like old times, as his wife lay in bed upstairs, listening to the murmur of laughter, the clink of the tiny glasses below. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into Palau's stay, Marcel's wife walked out of the master bedroom into the hall that overlooked the entryway and downstairs hall, where she saw her husband with his head cocked just so, looking curiously at the French table they had bought early in their marriage, before children, in a charming town in West Africa, a table that she took particular care of because of the emotional significance to her. He looked at it so curiously that she stepped backward into the doorway, watched him. He reached down and opened the drawer in which she kept a few photos of them from that trip, their young eyes squinting at the camera through the dusty air. And she heard a pencil roll back and then forward with the movement. She wound her hands in the polishing cloth she held and pulled it tight. She watched him pull the art pad from the drawer, the pad he had given his old friend. Nothing was on the top page, but Marcel held it up sideways to the light coming through the windows and door panes. He rubbed his thumb across it, feeling the grooves left from the drawing on the page before. She noticed the rug in the entryway beside him, how dull it had become with time and use, how it wanted cleaning, how she saw it so often she rarely anymore registered its faded colors or its cunning design. She watched him set the pad on the table, reach into the drawer, hold up the pencil. Palau's pencil, shortened with use to 2 inches. He studied it for a moment, unwound a little string from the tip, exposing the rounded nub. He held it in his fingers and looked at it, and then into the distance, past their favorite mirror on the wall, as if he was thinking of what to draw or how to draw it. She dipped her head and raised the cloth and her clenched fists to her mouth, breathed in, smelled wood polish and hard soap. Palau slid her socks across the kitchen floor's hard wood and pretended she was ice skating. She reached the doorway and saw Marcel in the hall, holding the pencil he had given her and looking at his own face in a small mirror on the wall, a mirror that was, to her taste, desperately ostentatious. He had the most unusual posture, and she wanted to draw it. She almost always wanted to draw him because he so often held his body in ways that other people didn't. But her pad and pencil were there with Marcel, and she didn't want to disturb whatever he was about to do, which would certainly be something, she could tell. He didn't seem to have heard her. She slid forward another foot the better to see him and ate another of the cherry tomatoes that she cupped in her hands. He looked from his own reflection down to the pencil and slowly licked the rounded charcoal tip once, then again, in a way that tingled from the soft part of Palau's thighs up her belly. From upstairs, Palau heard a gasp, and then a door closing sharply, and footsteps. Marcel looked up in alarm, then around him, and saw her there, in her yellowy V-neck shirt, drawstring sweatpants, socks. She pushed the last little tomato halfway into her mouth, and as she bit it, her grin broadened into a full smile. Juice gushed out and spilled into her hand, and she laughed and licked it off, looked up at him and winked. She skated down the hall to him, gliding right and left, and when she reached the table, she circled her arms around him to grasp the pad of paper, then plucked the pencil stub from his fingers. "Merci," she whispered in his ear, still smiling, and slid away to the back patio toward the clatter of halyards in the harbor below. She stayed another few days before leaving, taking with her only the duffel bag that she had brought when she arrived. Marcel's wife died late the next year, and he wept at her bedside, at her funeral, and at times in the weeks that followed when the emptiness she left seemed too wide for him to cross alone. He spent more time at his desk smoking, staring out the window at the sky as it changed from dark blue to light and then dark again, purple and black. And after only a few months of this, he realized he couldn't quite recall the details of his wife's face. Only at times her shoulder, or her back and forth gait, or the way her hands held a knife, or his own. Even photographs slid out of his mind after only a few minutes. He thought to draw her, though it had never been a skill of his, hoping the art of recall would set her more securely in his memory, the loss digging him like a spur. So he searched out an odd pad of art paper and charcoal pencil. He moved the pencil over the paper, drawing curves and lines, and the portrait, though rough, carried something of his wife. So, like the novice he was, he kept drawing more lines, trying to fill in the details of her cheeks, the spaces below her eyes, the way her hair hung. He carried the pad around the house, remembering her in this place or that, and ended up in the dining room where they had sat across from one another so many times. But the more times he drew, the more lines, the more he shaded and filled, the more he lost her likeness, and the more the woman in the picture, he finally realized, resembled not his wife, but his old friend, Palau. He set down the pad, the pencil, and put his face in his hands.